Evelyn Carter didn't look at drivers anymore. She looked through them the way people in power learned to filter out everything that wasn't urgent, profitable, or catastrophic. And today was all three, as her phone vibrated non-stop with messages marked Red Priority, the kind that only appeared when a deal was seconds away from collapsing. And not just any deal, but the $38 million logistics contract that had taken her company 3 years to secure, the one that would either cement Carter Dynamics as a global force or expose it as a fragile illusion built on perfectly timed luck. And as she stepped into the back seat of a slightly worn black sedan that smelled faintly of coffee and something softer, maybe baby lotion, she didn't bother to greet the driver. Didn't notice the small pink backpack on the passenger seat or the crayon drawing tucked into the dashboard. She only snapped downtown. Fast. Already dialing into a call where her CTO's voice was breaking under pressure. We're losing synchronization across 3 warehouse nodes. Routing data is duplicating and then disappearing. I don't understand. It's like the system is rewriting itself, and Evelyn closed her eyes, pressing 2 fingers against her temple because this wasn't possible. Not today. Not hours before final verification. Not when investors were already seated in a glass tower waiting to decide whether her company lived or died. And then too casually, too quietly, the driver spoke. "It's not rewriting itself," he said. His voice calm in a way that didn't belong in a crisis. "It's being told to lie." And the car seemed to shrink around that sentence as Evelyn's eyes snapped open, her irritation flaring instantly, because the last thing she needed was commentary from a rideshare driver who clearly didn't understand the weight of what he'd just interrupted, but something in his tone, steady, precise, almost surgical, made her hesitate just long enough to ask, "Excuse me?" And in the rearview mirror, she finally saw him properly. For the first time, a man in his mid-30s, tired eyes but sharp, like he was always calculating something beneath the surface. One hand steady on the wheel, the other resting near a child's glittery hair clip that must have belonged to the little girl now watching them silently from the front seat. Her wide eyes flicking between the 2 adults as if she sensed something important was unfolding, and the driver continued as if explaining something simple. "If your warehouse nodes are losing sync simultaneously, it's not a system failure. It's a trust breach in your data layer. Something upstream is feeding conflicting truths." And Evelyn felt something unfamiliar cut through her frustration. Uncertainty, sharp and unwelcome. Because that was not a guess. That was not something someone improvised. That was a diagnosis. And yet it came from a man whose job, at least on paper, was to drive her from one building to another, not dismantle multi-million-dollar systems with a single sentence. And her CTO's panicked voice crackled again through the speaker. "Evelyn, if we don't fix this in the next hour, the entire contract is void. They'll walk." But Evelyn wasn't listening anymore. Not to him, not to the investors, not even to the ticking clock that had defined her entire career. Because for the first time that day, she was staring at the reflection of a stranger who should have been invisible. A single dad with a quiet voice and a child in the front seat, and realizing with a slow, chilling clarity that the most important answer in a $38 million crisis might be sitting right in front of her, hidden in plain sight, pretending to be nothing more than a temporary driver. Evelyn didn't respond right away, not because she didn't want to, but because something in Daniel Hayes' tone had shifted the entire rhythm of her thinking, like a single wrong note, revealing that the entire orchestra had been out of tune all along, and she hated that feeling more than anything, hated losing control of a situation she was supposed to dominate. Yet as the city blurred past the tinted windows and her CTO's voice continued spiraling into panic through the speaker, she found herself saying, almost against her own instincts, "Pull over when we reach the office garage. You're coming inside." And the silence that followed was not disbelief, but something quieter. Something measured as Daniel nodded once, like he had already anticipated that decision while in the front seat. Lily turned around with a small, curious smile that seemed entirely out of place. In a moment where millions of dollars were evaporating by the second, and when the car finally slid into the underground parking of Carter Dynamics, Evelyn was already out before the engine fully died, heels striking concrete with sharp urgency. Her phone pressed to her ear as she snapped orders at her team. Lock down external access, freeze all outbound routing commands. I want a full audit trail in 10 minutes. But even as she spoke, she glanced back just once to make sure he was following, and he was guiding Lily gently by the hand. His presence strangely steady amid the chaos that greeted them as the elevator doors opened onto a floor buzzing with tension. Engineers pacing screens, flashing red alerts, assistants whispering as if the building itself could sense that something critical was breaking, and the moment Daniel stepped into that space, the contrast became almost uncomfortable. His worn jacket and quiet demeanor clashing with the polished urgency of executives who barely acknowledged his existence, except for the security guard who instinctively moved to block his path until Evelyn cut in sharply. "He's with me," a statement that drew more than a few raised eyebrows because Evelyn Carter did not bring drivers into crisis rooms. She barely tolerated them at the front door, and yet here he was walking beside her as if he belonged, while Lily lingered close, her small hand gripping his fingers with quiet trust. And when they entered the main operations room, the air shifted again. A wall of screens displaying fragmented data flows, red warning indicators, blinking like alarms no one could silence. And at the center of it all stood Marcus Reed, her CTO. His usually composed expression cracked by stress as he turned toward Evelyn with something dangerously close to desperation. "We've isolated the failure points, but nothing makes sense. The system is executing valid commands, but the outputs are inconsistent. It's like..." And he stopped mid-sentence when he noticed Daniel, his confusion instantly morphing into irritation. "Who is this?" And Evelyn didn't have time for explanations, not when the clock was still bleeding seconds, so she simply said, "Someone who might see what we're missing," and that was enough to trigger a ripple of skepticism through the room, engineers exchanging glances, one of them even muttering under his breath about desperation leading to bad decisions. But Daniel didn't react, didn't defend himself, or try to assert authority. He just stepped closer to the central display, his eyes moving across the data with a focus that was almost unsettling in its intensity, like he was listening to something no one else could hear. And for a moment, nothing happened. Just silence stretching thin as everyone waited for him to either prove himself or confirm their doubts until he spoke not loudly but clearly enough to cut through the noise. "You're chasing the wrong failure," he said, pointing not at the flashing red zones, but at a section of the system that appeared stable. "This part hasn't triggered an alert because it's doing exactly what it's told." "But that's the problem." And Marcus frowned, stepping closer. "That's the authentication layer. It hasn't shown any anomalies." And Daniel nodded slightly. "Because it's been compromised at the logic level, not the execution level. The commands are valid, but the intent behind them isn't." And again, that silence fell heavier this time, because this wasn't guesswork. This was structured, precise. And Evelyn felt it again, that unsettling shift where certainty began to crack. And yet before she could push further, a small voice broke through the tension. "Why are they all so scared?" Lily asked, her tone soft but impossibly clear. And every head in the room turned not in annoyance but in something closer to surprise, as if they had all forgotten that a child was present. And Evelyn looked down at her, caught off guard in a way she couldn't quite explain. Because the question was simple, almost naive, but it cut deeper than any technical diagnosis. And before anyone else could answer, Daniel crouched slightly beside his daughter, his voice gentle, because they think something important is about to be lost. And Lily tilted her head, considering that. But if they're smart, shouldn't they be able to fix it? And the innocence of that logic hit Evelyn harder than she expected, because it exposed the fear none of them wanted to admit, that intelligence alone wasn't enough, when the system itself could no longer be trusted. And for a moment the room softened, the tension bending just enough for something human to slip through. And Evelyn found herself saying quieter now, "Sometimes knowing what's wrong is harder than fixing it." And Lily accepted that answer with a small nod as if filing it away, then looked back at the screens with genuine curiosity rather than fear. And somehow that steadiness so different from the panic of seasoned professionals shifted something in Evelyn, grounding her just enough to refocus. To look at Daniel not as a risk, but as a possibility, and she stepped closer to him, lowering her voice. "If you're right, prove it." And this time there was no hesitation in his response, no uncertainty, just a calm readiness as he reached for a terminal, pausing only long enough to ask, "May I?" A courtesy that felt almost out of place in a room where everyone else had already abandoned politeness for urgency. And when she nodded, he began not by diving into code, but by mapping out the system's data flow in a way that revealed patterns no one had noticed, tracing connections that seemed invisible until he pointed them out. And as minutes passed, the skepticism in the room began to erode, replaced by a reluctant attention that grew into something more focused, more intent. And Evelyn watched it happen. Watched the shift from dismissal to curiosity to something dangerously close to belief. And in the corner of her vision, she saw Lily settle into a chair, quietly drawing on a piece of paper she had found, as if the chaos around her was just another backdrop to a world she trusted her father to navigate. And that trust, simple and unwavering, began to echo in Evelyn's mind in a way she couldn't ignore, because for the first time since the crisis began, she wasn't just reacting to failure, she was watching someone move toward the truth with a clarity that felt almost inevitable. And as Daniel finally leaned back, his eyes lifting from the screen to meet hers, there was no triumph in his expression, no need to prove himself, only a quiet certainty as he said, "It's not a glitch. Someone is feeding your system false instructions that look real," and the weight of that statement settled over the room like a storm about to break, because if he was right, this wasn't just a technical failure anymore. It was something far more dangerous, something intentional. And Evelyn felt the stakes shift beneath her feet, the crisis transforming into something deeper, more personal, as she realized that the man she had dismissed as just a temporary driver might be the only one who could lead her through what was coming next. Evelyn didn't speak immediately after Daniel's conclusion, not because she doubted him, but because accepting what he had just said meant crossing an invisible line she had spent her entire career avoiding, the moment when a problem stopped being technical and started being human, intentional, dangerous. And the room felt it too, the subtle shift from confusion to suspicion, from panic to something colder, more calculating, as Marcus exhaled slowly and ran a hand through his hair. "You're saying someone inside the system is manipulating authenticated commands?" And Daniel nodded, once his gaze still fixed on the data, as if it were telling him a story no one else could read. Not just manipulating, guiding. "Whoever did this understands your architecture well enough to hide inside it," and that sentence landed like a detonation, because Carter Dynamics' core infrastructure was not public knowledge. It had been built layer by layer, secured, audited, protected, and yet Daniel spoke about it with an ease that made Evelyn's pulse tighten. Because there was only one way someone could see through it like this. They had either designed something like it, or they had once been part of it. And before she could question him further, another alert flashed across the main screen. This time, sharper, more aggressive routing commands collapsing in real time, as if the system itself was beginning to cannibalize its own logic. And Marcus cursed under his breath. "We're losing another node." But Daniel leaned forward faster now, his calm replaced by urgency. "No, you're being pushed," he said, fingers moving across the keyboard in controlled precision, not hacking but observing tracing patterns. "Look here and here. The timing is too perfect. These commands aren't reacting to failures, they're anticipating them." And Evelyn stepped beside him, her voice low. "Can you isolate the source?" And for the first time, Daniel hesitated, not out of uncertainty but calculation. "I can try. But if I'm right, they'll know we're looking." And the implication hung heavy in the air, because this was no longer about saving a deal, it was about exposing someone who had been hiding in plain sight. And yet, Evelyn didn't pull back, didn't hesitate, because something in her had already decided. "Do it," she said. And in that single word, the direction of everything changed. Daniel moved quickly now, mapping command origins, filtering through layers of legitimate traffic, peeling back the illusion of normal operations until patterns began to emerge, subtle at first, almost indistinguishable from routine processes, but then clearer, more deliberate, like footprints that only appeared when you knew where to look. And Marcus leaned in closer, his skepticism gone, replaced by a growing unease. "That's internal," he murmured. And Evelyn felt her chest tighten because internal meant betrayal. And betrayal at this level meant something far worse than a technical failure. It meant someone had decided the company should fall, and as the data continued to unravel, Daniel finally stopped his fingers hovering over the keyboard, as if he had reached the edge of something dangerous. "There," he said quietly, highlighting a sequence of commands that didn't belong. Commands that originated from a user profile with full system privileges, one that had no reason to be issuing routing overrides, and the name attached to it made the entire room go still, because it wasn't an unknown account. It wasn't an external breach. It was someone they all knew, someone who sat at the highest levels of the company. Someone who had been in the boardroom just hours ago, presenting confidence and stability while quietly undermining everything beneath it. And Evelyn's voice dropped to a whisper she barely recognized as her own. "That's impossible." But Daniel didn't look at her, didn't soften the truth. "It's not," he said, "and it's been happening for days, maybe longer." And the weight of that realization crashed into her all at once, the meetings, the subtle delays, the unexplained discrepancies she had dismissed as stress or coincidence, all aligning into a pattern she could no longer ignore. And before she could process it fully, Lily's voice drifted softly from behind them. "Is someone trying to break your company?" And the simplicity of the question cut deeper than any technical explanation, because it stripped away the complexity and left only the truth. And Evelyn turned, meeting the child's eyes, and for a moment she couldn't answer because admitting it out loud would make it real. But Daniel did, his voice steady, even as everything around them shifted. "Yes," he said gently, "but we're going to stop them." And Lily nodded, accepting that without doubt, as if the outcome had already been decided. And something about that quiet faith grounded Evelyn again, pulling her back from the edge of panic into something sharper, more focused, because if this was a deliberate attack, then it wasn't just about fixing the system anymore. It was about exposing the person behind it before they could finish what they started. And she turned back to the screens, her voice cutting through the room with renewed authority. "We don't confront them yet," she said, her mind already racing through the implications. "If they know we're onto them, they'll escalate. We need proof, undeniable proof." And Marcus nodded, already understanding. "A full trace end to end," and Daniel added quietly, "and we need to let them keep thinking they're winning, and that strategy, dangerous as it was, made perfect sense, because the only way to catch someone who was hiding inside the system was to give them enough room to reveal themselves completely." And as the plan took shape, Evelyn felt something shift inside her again. Not just fear or anger, but something deeper. A recognition that the man beside her was not just helping. He was leading in a way no one else could see, in connections that others missed, anticipating moves before they happened, and the question she had been holding back finally surfaced, sharp and unavoidable. "You've done this before," she said, her eyes locking onto his, and for a brief moment, something flickered across his expression. Not pride, but something heavier, something closer to regret, before he answered, "I've seen what happens when systems are trusted more than people." And that wasn't a denial. It was a confession of experience, and Evelyn felt the final piece click into place, because this wasn't just a man who understood the system. This was someone who had once lived inside it, someone who knew its strengths and its vulnerabilities in a way that only a creator or a destroyer could. And as the realization settled in, another alert flashed, this one different. Not a failure, but a trigger. A command sequence activating across multiple nodes at once, faster than anything they had seen before. And Daniel's voice sharpened instantly. "They're accelerating," he said, his hands moving again. "They're trying to push the system into a full collapse before we can expose them," and the room erupted into motion. Engineers scrambling, Marcus issuing rapid commands. But Evelyn stayed focused on Daniel because in that moment, he was the only one who seemed to understand the full scope of what was happening. And as he worked, she saw it clearly now. The hidden genius she had nearly ignored, the quiet expertise that had been buried beneath a life she didn't understand, and the terrifying truth that without him, this company would already be finished. And as he finally looked up again, his expression more intense than before, he said the words that would change everything. "I know how to stop this. But you're not going to like what it costs." And the room fell silent once more because whatever came next was not going to be simple. And Evelyn, for the first time that day, felt the full weight of what she was about to risk. Not just a deal, not just a company, but the truth itself, and whether she was ready or not, there was no turning back now. Evelyn didn't ask what it would cost right away because something in Daniel's voice told her the answer wasn't measured in money or contracts, but in something far more personal. Something that would change not just the outcome of the crisis, but the people inside it, and the room seemed to sense that shift too. The frantic urgency softening into a tense stillness, as if everyone understood that the next decision would define everything that followed. And Daniel finally spoke quieter now. "To stop them, I have to expose the core architecture. The real one." He said, his eyes flicking briefly toward the screens, and then away, as if what he was about to reveal carried weight beyond the moment. "The system you're running now isn't just vulnerable. It was built on a framework that can be controlled if someone knows where to look." And Evelyn felt her breath catch slightly, because that meant the problem wasn't just an attack, it was something embedded deeper, something foundational. And she asked almost cautiously, "And you know where to look?" And he nodded. But this time there was no confidence in the gesture, only acceptance. "Because I designed something like it, years ago." And the words landed softly, but carried enormous gravity. And for a moment the noise of the room seemed to fade entirely as Evelyn studied him. Really studied him. Seeing not just the quiet driver she had met hours ago, but the shadow of someone who had once stood at the center of systems like hers. Someone who had walked away or been forced out. And before she could press further, Lily's small voice drifted in again, gentle but unwavering. "Is that why you stopped doing it?" And the question so simple and unguarded, cut through layers of professional distance that no executive conversation ever could. And Daniel hesitated just for a second before crouching down to her level, his voice softer than it had been all day. "I stopped because I hurt people without meaning to." He admitted, not looking at anyone else in the room, just at his daughter. "I built something powerful, and someone used it the wrong way. And I didn't see it until it was too late." And Lily listened carefully, her brow slightly furrowed as she processed that. "But you're fixing it now," she said, not as a question but as a certainty. And something in that quiet belief seemed to steady him in a way nothing else had, because when he stood again, there was a different kind of strength in him. Not the detached precision of a technician, but the grounded resolve of someone who had chosen to face what he once walked away from. And Evelyn felt it too, that shift from reluctance to purpose, and it moved something inside her that she hadn't expected, because for the first time since the crisis began, this wasn't just about saving a deal or protecting a company. It was about giving someone a chance to make something right. And she found herself saying more gently than she intended, "Then we do it your way." And the room didn't question her this time, didn't challenge the decision, because they had all seen enough to understand that this man, this so-called driver, was the only one who truly understood the battlefield they were standing on. And as Daniel began outlining what needed to be done, the plan unfolded not as a quick fix, but as a careful unraveling, a process that would expose the manipulation at its root while stabilizing the system long enough to prevent total collapse. But it came with a cost, just as he had warned, because revealing the true architecture meant admitting vulnerabilities to the investors, risking trust, risking reputation, risking everything Evelyn had built. And yet, as she listened, she realized something that surprised even herself, that she was no longer afraid of that risk in the same way, because hiding the truth would only delay the inevitable while confronting it openly. Honestly, might actually save more than just the company, and as the team moved into action. Following Daniel's lead with a focus that replaced earlier panic, Evelyn stepped back for a moment watching him work, watching the quiet confidence in his movements, the way he explained complex ideas in simple terms, the way he never raised his voice yet, commanded attention, and she thought about the hours before how easily she had dismissed him. How close she had come to ignoring the one person who could change everything, and the realization carried a weight that wasn't entirely comfortable because it forced her to confront something about herself, about the way she saw people, measured them, valued them. And in that moment, Lily wandered over, standing beside her with that same calm curiosity. "You were scared," before she said softly, and Evelyn glanced down, caught off guard again. "Was it that obvious?" she asked, and Lily nodded. "But you're not scared now." And Evelyn considered it before answering. "No, I'm not, because somehow in the middle of a crisis that should have been overwhelming, she felt something steadier than fear, something closer to clarity." And as Daniel called out a final adjustment, his voice firm but controlled, the system on the screens began to stabilize. The red alerts fading one by one, replaced by steady streams of synchronized data, and a quiet ripple of relief moved through the room. Not loud or celebratory, but deeply felt, because they all understood how close they had come to losing everything. And Marcus let out a long breath, shaking his head in disbelief. "I don't even know how you saw that," he admitted, and Daniel gave a small, almost tired smile. "Sometimes you see things more clearly when you've already lost them once," and that sentence lingered not just as a reflection of his past, but as a reminder of what had been at stake all along, and Evelyn stepped forward then, meeting his gaze, and for a moment there was no hierarchy between them, no CEO and driver, just two people who had stood on opposite sides of a crisis and somehow found a way through it together, and she said quietly, "You didn't just save the system." And he shook his head slightly. "We're not done yet," he replied, because even now, even in this moment of fragile calm, the truth behind the attack still remained the person responsible, still hidden, and the final confrontation still ahead. But something had changed, something fundamental, because this was no longer just a fight to survive. It was a chance to uncover the truth and maybe, just maybe, to heal something deeper along the way. And as Lily slipped her hand back into his, smiling up at him with that unwavering trust, it was clear that whatever came next, Daniel Hayes was no longer running from his past, and Evelyn Carter was no longer the same person who had stepped into that car just hours before. The boardroom fell into a silence that felt heavier than any argument as Evelyn stood at the head of the long glass table. Investors watching with guarded expressions, unaware that the presentation they were about to see would not just determine the fate of a $38 million deal, but expose a truth none of them were prepared for, and when the CFO began speaking, confident, controlled, weaving numbers into a narrative of temporary instability. Evelyn didn't interrupt right away. She let him finish, let the illusion hold just long enough to make what came next undeniable, and then she simply said, "Run the audit trace," and the room shifted as Marcus activated the sequence Daniel had built layer by layer, the data unfolding on the screen, not chaotic anymore, but precise. Structured, revealing patterns that could no longer hide behind complexity, and Daniel stood quietly near the back, not stepping forward, not claiming attention, just watching as the system told its own story. Commands rerouted permissions, misused a trail leading directly to the source, and when the name appeared clear and irrefutable, the CFO's composure cracked for the first time. His voice faltering as he tried to explain, to reframe, but it was already too late, because truth once seen could not be negotiated, and the room turned on him not with anger, but with cold certainty, the kind that ends careers in seconds. And as security moved in, the tension that had filled the company for hours finally broke, not in celebration, but in quiet release, because everyone understood how close they had come to losing everything. And as the investors shifted their attention back to Evelyn, their tone changed, respect replacing doubt. The deal salvaged not by perfection, but by honesty, by the willingness to confront what was broken instead of hiding it. And yet Evelyn didn't feel triumph, not in the way she had imagined she would, because her gaze had already moved across the room to where Daniel stood beside Lily, preparing to leave as quietly as he had arrived, and something in her tightened unexpectedly. Not fear this time, but something closer to reluctance, as if she was about to lose something she hadn't realized she needed, and she crossed the room before she could overthink it, stopping just short of them. Stay. She said the words simple, but carrying more weight than any contract she had ever signed. Lead the rebuild fix. Everything the position is yours. And for a moment, Daniel didn't answer, his hand resting lightly on Lily's shoulder as he looked at Evelyn, not with hesitation, but with clarity, the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you want. And then he shook his head gently. I already have everything I need, he said. His voice calm, and Evelyn felt the unexpected sting of that refusal, not as rejection, but as something deeper, a reminder that not all value could be measured in titles or power. And Lily looked up at her, then offering a small, sincere smile. We like our life, she added softly, and it was such a simple statement. Yet it carried a truth Evelyn couldn't ignore. That peace, real peace, didn't always come from winning. Sometimes it came from choosing what not to chase. And as they turned to leave, walking toward the elevator, their figures small against the vast, polished world of glass and ambition, Evelyn didn't call them back, didn't try to convince them otherwise. Because for the first time she understood that letting them go was not a loss. It was a kind of respect, and later, as she stood alone by the window overlooking the city, the chaos of the day finally settling into something quieter, she found herself thinking, not about the deal or the crisis, but about the moment in the car when everything could have gone differently, when she could have dismissed him completely and never known what she almost lost, and the realization stayed with her as a quiet lesson reshaping something inside her that no business victory ever had. And somewhere below, the black sedan merged into the flow of traffic carrying Daniel and Lily back to a life that was small, perhaps, but whole. And as Evelyn watched until it disappeared from view, a faint, unfamiliar smile touched her lips. Not because everything had been saved, but because something within her had finally changed, and this time she knew it would last.